There we go. And what we'll be doing is going in, excuse me, alphabetical order by site. So we will start with John Fielding at the Anthracite Heritage Museum and Eckley Miners Village. So John, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Dave. Just gonna share my screen here. Okay, everybody can see that? Okay, little thumbs up. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is the Anthracite Miner. I'm from the Anthracite Heritage Museum and Eckley Miners Village, and we really focus heavily on the skills and trades that the anthracite miner had to do his job. I'm going to focus on a little bit of some of the tools that the anthracite miner had, and I'm going to then present a short historic video at the end that shows miners in a historic setting, 1930s, actually using some of the tools that I'm going to highlight tonight. So the anthracite miner, he was a skilled laborer. He had many different skills. He had to have carpentry skills. He had to have mathematical skills because he handled dynamite and blasting, and you needed to know how much dynamite, gunpowder to use in certain circumstances to extract and create the coal and to create a certain amount of explosion to do that. So he had to have mathematical skills, chemistry skills. He had to have electrical working skills later on, and he also had to have some plumbing and carpentry skills as well. So being an anthracite miner was a skilled labor job. In order to become an anthracite miner, a person had to spend, in the state of Pennsylvania, a person had to spend 2 years working underground in an anthracite mine before they could take a test to become a miner. Once they passed that test, then the test was about knowledge and safety of anthracite mining. So once they passed that test, they got a certificate like the one that you see on the right of my screen. That enabled them to be a qualified miner. Then they could then go and apply for jobs, for miner jobs. Just because they got their certificate didn't mean they were automatically promoted. But once a miner got a job, got the certificate, got his job, he could then supervise other mine employees, including laborers, who were the semi-skilled workers that worked underneath him. And we see in the photograph over here a miner. He's actually using what they call a pony drill, and he's drilling into a seam of coal. But miners had a lot of different tools and equipment, and some of them here we have the miners' lights and helmets. So in the far left, we have a canvas hat with a wick lamp on top of it. And those types of hats and lamps were used beginning of the 19th or the 20th century, so around 1900. They would have been very prevalent in the anthracite mining industry. Then we move across the board to the right. The next hat that we have is called a tortoiseshell hat. That allowed the miner to have some ventilation as well as protection on his head because the top is a hard shell to prevent falls of rock. Then we have a carbide lamp followed by a carbide container. The next lamp, the tall brass lamp, that's actually a safety lamp. It doesn't provide any or much light for the miner, but it does test the mine for explosive and poisonous gases that might be in his working area. And then lastly, all the way to the right, we have a electric battery lamp attached to a hard bakelite cap. And from the period of 1900 to 1930, all of these lamps, this is kind of the progression from 1900 to 1930. And even though by 1930 most miners had the battery lamps, a lot of them still kept all of the other equipment because the miners, they paid for their equipment on their own right. So all their equipment they paid, and they had backups. So they kept their old stuff oftentimes as a backup in case their main equipment broke. Then we have some miners' drills here. These are hand drills, a variety of hand drills. Miners may have obtained these around 1900. Some miners were actually still using these well into the 1950s. Yet, however, other drills became more common and more prevalent as time went on, such as on the bottom here we have a jackhammer style drill. This is a pneumatic jackhammer that was purchased by an anthracite miner in the 1920s and used there. And then later on in the 30s, we have electric. Trying to scroll here. We have electric drills. So this red drill right here is an example of the type of drill that anthracite miners were purchasing on their own. In this case, the anthracite miner, John Zavitosky, his family purchased this for him as a Father's Day gift to kind of prevent him from inhaling so much coal dust. That was a common problem with the handheld drills, the amount of dust they produced. So once they drilled the hole, we get into the blasting. Miners have to insert dynamite. We have, in order to blast and extract the coal, so they had a variety of tools to do that.
Know. I read the fucking book. I went to the fucking mine.
So we have the different types of tools over here.
More interesting than this shit.
Excuse me, go ahead and mute your microphone, please.
So we have the miner's scraper to the right here, and then we have a miner's needle. They're both in the right photograph. So we have the miner's needle, which then the miner would insert dynamite into the hole. But before he could actually put the dynamite in the hole, he had to scrape it out, hence the scraper, and clean all the debris out of the coal. Once the miner then inserted the dynamite and attached all of his blasting cables, he could then detonate it. And we have in the very left photograph, we have the blasting materials. So those are detonators. There's a tall, large detonator. It's a black detonator, sort of like the one that the miner in the photograph is using. We also have a smaller handheld detonator that is a copper detonator, and we'll see one later on in the movie that I'm going to show that's being used by a miner himself. So once they got done blasting, the miner then had to set up, check the roof to make sure it didn't fall on him or his laborers, and then they would set up props, so timber props. And once they set up the timber props, we have a variety of tools seen over here in the right that are on display, in this case at the Museum of Anthracite Mining in Ashland. But these are a variety of different timbering tools, like cant hooks, saws, adzes, and axes, as well as timber dogs and sledgehammers. So the miner had a variety of tools that he used for his occupation. And I'm going to put this short video on. It's about 2 minutes long. It's a part of Digging Deep, which was filmed at the Hazelbrook Colliery in 1935. Although some of the scenes, I believe, were actually shot in the 1920s and just edited in. So this will give you a good example of how some of those tools were used. So look for the hats, the scrapers, and some of the drills, particularly also like some of the safety lamps that were used as well. And I'm just going to try to play that here.
The shaft is like a well, 1,000 feet deep, down which the miners are lowered in a cage, down into the darkness where everything is damp, water trickling through on all sides. Carloads of timber must be brought down to hold up the roofs, because without support they'd be dangerous. So heavy timbers of hard wood are cut and fitted into place. Dangerous gases are sometimes encountered, which must be driven out and replaced by fresh air for the safety of the workmen and the workings. Every morning before the miners enter, inspectors or fire bosses must inspect every nook and cranny with a safety lamp, and then place a record of his findings where it can be plainly seen. Back in the early days of mining, the coal was loosened by the back-breaking use of the pick, but now they blast it with explosives, placed in holes, drilled deep in the face of the solid vein. Handling dynamite's a ticklish job, and great care and skill must be used. After several cartridges have been pushed to the back of the hole, a final cartridge is prepared for the firing with a detonating cap, to which is attached 2 wires. After this is inserted and the rest of the hole plugged up, the wires from the cap are connected to an electric battery from a safe distance. Look out now. Hold your ears. Maybe the place where the coal was blown out is gassy, and another inspection with a safety lamp is necessary. If it is safe, the loose coal is allowed to float down and into the waiting cars, each holding 4 or 5 tons.
So, and then that pretty much ends the video right there. And then once the coal is loaded into the miner's, once the coal is loaded into the car, then the miner's job is essentially done. He repeats that process over again. The coal goes to the breaker and gets broken down. So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed my presentation and learned something. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, John. It strikes me they're showing on film a guy with a safety lamp coming into a recently blasted area, checking for gas. But if there was gas, wouldn't we have seen it live on film blow up?
No, not well, maybe, but yeah, a lot of times, after they were supposed to wait several minutes after the the blast to go in and check too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe they did a test for the benefit of the camera.
Perhaps, yes.
Great. Well, thank you, John. So we move from one Pennsylvania industry to another. Next up is Mike Emery, Cornwall Iron Furnace, and looking at some of the tools of iron. So Mike, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Is my screen visible? All right, thank you very much for the confirmation. So let me introduce myself again. My name is Mike Emery. I'm the site administrator of the Cornwall Iron Furnace. And since we're new to the collection showcase, I just wanted to go ahead and say a little bit about the site. So let me see if I can get this to work. So the mission of the Cornwall Iron Furnace is to preserve, collect, and interpret the history of the sole surviving charcoal-fueled iron furnace in North America for the diverse people of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and for the visiting public. The Cornwall Iron Furnace is administered by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission and is actively supported by the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace, which is a nonprofit community-based organization. So this is what the furnace looks like today. The current structure dates to a building campaign of the late 1850s, and the building's in a Gothic revival style. Again, the significance of the site is that this is the most complete cold blast iron furnace in North America. And you can see that it's made up of several different areas in which iron was being produced. You can see that the section to the right holds the blast apparatus. There in the center, you can see the furnace stack. And to the left is the casting house. And the artifacts that we're going to talk about today really deal with the casting house. So here are the objects that we're going to talk about. These are gutter tools that were used in the molding and the iron and slag handling process. So these were these long-handled tools used by the molders and guttermen, and they were used to move both iron and slag during this process of casting. The longest bar is just over 12 feet long, and the shortest is about 6.5 feet long. I've included myself with the photo just to give you an idea of the scale. The furnace operated until 1883, and many items were left with the building after its closure. And that included charcoal buggies, ore buggies, and some of the casting tools. Over time, things that were useful on other parts of the Cornwall estate, like rakes and shovels, were taken and used elsewhere. Because of the length and the weight of these tools, they survived with the building. So gutter and casting tools changed very little over the lifetime of the furnace. This image was drawn circa 1800 and shows the Cornwall iron plantation, including the furnace, the mine, owner's house, workers' homes, waterways, orchards, roads, and mills. But if you look carefully, there are also insets. And in the upper right, there's an inset of the owner's house. Below that is an image of the furnace itself. And below that, very bottom right, you can see the casting arch of the furnace stack. So this is that image blown up. So you can also see that the artist not only drew the furnace stack, but many of the tools used in the casting room. Visible are a rake, shovels, and many iron bars, several of which are hooked at the end. I should mention briefly just how a blast furnace works. Charcoal, iron ore, and limestone would be loaded into the top of the furnace in alternating layers. This would happen about once an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for about 10 months out of the year. Since charcoal did not burn hot enough to melt the iron ore, extra air was added to increase the temperature. The furnace workers worked a 12-hour shift. During each shift, the furnace would be tapped. First, the waste product was drawn off of the top of the molten material. That was known as slag, and then the iron would be drawn off after that. At places like Cornwall, much of the iron was cast into a sand casting floor, and it was made into ingots known as pigs. That's what's being shown in this image. A couple of things to note. Look at what the men are holding, these very long-handled pieces. You also notice that they are working or casting pigs into the floor. Although this image dates to the mid-1800s, the technology itself is much older. So this engraving is from the 1780s and is of the Coalbrookdale furnace in Shropshire, England. This is showing an evening pour where the men are illuminated by the glowing molten iron. The guttermen are moving the iron along the gutter and into molds made in the casting floor. This is very similar to the last image, but that image is 70 years later. Now this is an image and an enlargement that are from Diderot's encyclopedia, which was created in France during the 1750s through the 1770s. And Diderot's is a great resource to see tradesmen and their tools. The Cornwall gutter tools are part of how the iron workers stayed safe while there was nearly 3,000 pounds of molten metal and 3,000 pounds of slag in the casting room at any time. The length of the tools provided distance from the molten material. Now, these workers that you can see on the right also show some of the other safety equipment of the day, such as complete body covering, the clothing that they're wearing, a leather apron, and wooden molder's shoes. While very mundane looking, these gutter casting tools are a very rare survivor, particularly because they are provenance to this furnace. These tools were part of a toolkit that allowed furnacemen to cast iron. The length provided workers some measure of safety in what was an extremely hot and dangerous environment. So thank you very much. I'll leave you with this image of what the Cornwall casting room looked like 50 years ago. And note the gutter tools are there and to the right in the casting arch, and that's where they're located to this day. So I thank you very much and look forward to the rest of the presenters this evening.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate the insights and the fact that you've got a connection to tools you talked about to the furnace that we preserve. That's really cool. So we switch from land-based industry going across the state to water. So we now come to Linda in Erie Maritime and her presentation on, I think it's correspondence courses. Oh. There we go. Linda, you're on mute.
There we go.
There we go.
Sorry. Okay, we'll get this. There we are, back to normal here. Okay, I've selected an object to share with you this evening that's not a hand tool or an object used in trade. I've chosen something that represents the first step toward acquiring the most important tool in education. And that can be in a new trade and opening up a new world of opportunities. Now, what's not obvious here is that some of the coursework in this booklet is a direct result of a huge change in how the US Navy created its officer corps at the beginning of the 20th century. As a result of the Navy Personnel Act of March 3rd, 1901, for the first time in US Navy history, an enlisted sailor could earn an officer's commission based in part on his technical knowledge and proficiency. No longer did a man need to get an appointment and complete his education at the US Naval Academy to become a commissioned naval officer. So how does an enlisted man on active duty get this education? Why, the ICS, of course. As enlisted man on, or as a correspondence school, the ICS offered an enlisted man coursework via postal mail. So he could work in his spare time, anytime, anywhere in the world, and without interruption to his active service. Now, the International Correspondent School is an institution with deep Pennsylvania roots. It was founded in Scranton in 1891 as the Colliery Engineers School of Mines. It provided safety and technical education to coal miners and was America's first distance learning institution. It grew to become the ICS in 1895. Within 10 years, 1 out of every 27 adults in the United States had taken an ICS course. To this day, the US branch of the school still operates out of Scranton under the name Penn Foster Career School. So what courses are offered to ambitious sailors? Even the most poorly educated landsman or coal passer could study and become a machinist's mate, an electrician, a carpenter's mate, a boilermaker, a ship fitter, or a plumber. Acquiring these skills and demonstrating proficiency offered promotion to warrant officer, and while not a commissioned rank, this guaranteed a significant raise in pay and a comfortable pension for a career Navy man. Men who practiced at such trades before enlisting, through the ICS exam, they could gain their warrant immediately. So while the coursework leading to a possible commission was available through the ICS, its real attraction was offering achievable economic advancement to any man through a rise in his rating and promotion to warrant officer. Now, the Navy had its own educational facilities for enlisted men and training bases throughout the United States, of course, but the ICF offered another option for men on active duty elsewhere. Testimonials throughout the booklet, such as this one from warrant machinist T.G. Sprengel, attest to the success. Now, testimonials from traditionally commissioned officers also grace these pages, pointing out the value of their own ICS course studies, preparing them for their examinations for promotion. Noteworthy is the testimony of then Lieutenant John Grady, whose service later merited both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. He studied navigation as a commissioned officer through the ICS. And the quality of ICS's materials was absolutely well known, so much so that by World War II, the ICS was given the US War Department contract to develop the department's training materials and training manuals. So I hope you enjoyed a quick look between the pages of this booklet and understand how much more of a tremendous change it represents.
Great. Maybe a point of clarification, Linda, with the knowledge you have of this program, would the soldiers have to pay for the classes themselves, or would they be paid for by the Navy?
As far as I've seen, they're paid for by the enlisted man. So the sailors are paying. However, the Navy really did invest in the ICF or ICS. There were instructors designated on board some of the larger ships too, that the sailors could talk with and get a little bit of help. The instructors also offered the examination. So this was pretty pervasive, enough to have these instructors embedded on ships deployed around the world.
Well, I find it fascinating that we have someone from anthracite country and someone from our maritime port, and something that kind of links from Scranton to both fields. Really fascinating. Thank you so much for that presentation, Linda. Next, we go from water to more terrestrial conveyance, I guess a land yacht. And so without further ado, we transfer to Jen Royer and the wonderful world of the Conestoga. So Jen, it's yours.
I am going to talk about the Conestoga Wagon, which was a freight hauling vehicle that the Pennsylvania Germans developed in Lancaster County, starting before 1750 to transport agricultural products and rural-made goods over primitive roads to Philadelphia and Baltimore. Designed as freight haulers, they compare well with the tractor trailers of today. Now, if you only remember one thing I say today, please let it be, the Conestoga Wagon is not a prairie schooner. Conestoga wagons did not go out west. They did not carry families on the Oregon Trail. The prairie schooner was lighter and more efficient. They only required 2 to 6 oxen to pull them, and they could carry up to 2,500 pounds of cargo. They also had room for people to ride. So the Conestoga Wagon's not a prairie schooner, but what is it? The Conestoga Wagon was much larger and heavier than a to pull a fully loaded Conestoga Wagon, you needed 6 Conestoga horses or oxen. The Conestoga horse was the first outstanding horse to be developed in America. The Conestoga horse was developed to be long-legged, sturdy in the chest with long arching necks, calm in disposition, and they tended to be black. They were highly regarded for their strength, speed, endurance, and muscular flesh. The horses were carefully trained and made excellent teams for rigorous work of heavy hauls over roads that were often rutted, stony, or full of mud. Conestoga horses were bred and raised by Pennsylvania Germans and were very valuable and highly desirable. When the Conestoga Wagon was no longer used, the Conestoga horse was allowed to die out. The Conestoga teamster saddle, seen on the top right, had long, heavy leather skirts that kept road grit from getting between the saddle and the horse's skin. Similarly, broad leather collar housings protected the horses' necks. This was very important because if infected collar sores could halt a Conestoga in its tracks and threaten the health of the horses. Each of the 6 Conestoga horses wore a rack of bells, seen on the bottom right, that warned other traffic on early roads of their approach. Their use may have come from the very old Swiss-German practice of hanging bells on livestock to keep them from getting lost. If a teamster had a mishap while traveling and another stopped to help him, it became customary to give that man a rack of bells for his favor. The saying, "I will be there with bells on," may have come from the practice of giving a rack of bells away when help was needed. Conestoga wagons were handmade. No 2 were exactly alike, and the measurements of each wagon differed slightly. However, they were all examples of Pennsylvania German folk art, and they all had the same color scheme: vermilion red running gear and sideboards, a Prussian blue wagon body, and a snow white homespun canvas cover. The paint was oil-based, consisting of pigments ground in linseed oil. The bright colors supposedly hid the dirt better than a darker color. The iron on the Conestoga wagons were made by a blacksmith. The iron on the Shriner wagon, which was built and used within miles of Landis Valley and is on display at the museum, was created by Landis Valley resident Devil John Landis and bears his stamp. This is the Shriner wagon from a rare view of looking down on it. The Conestoga wagon bed had no seats in the wagon bed, which was devoted entirely to cargo such as barrels of grain or flour, cured meats, kegs of whiskey or cider, woven linen, hemp fiber, tanned animal skins, and lumber. For the trip home, the wagon might carry imported goods or products crafted by specialized urban craftsmen. The wagon driver rode the horse closest to the left wheel, walked, or sat on the lazy board, a pull-out plank that some wagons had below the toolbox. Because the tradition of German-speaking people from Central Europe was to drive a horse team from the left side, wagon makers and buyers in this region oriented the Conestogas to that custom. The toolbox, seen in the upper right image, brake lever, all-purpose axe, lazy board, brake chain, and tar bucket for axle grease, seen in the bottom right, were all placed on the left side. The wagon driver controlled the team with a single long jerk line running to the lead horse at the left front. The Pennsylvania Germans' preference for operating the wagon from the left side and driving it on the right side of the road may have had bearing on the accepted American practice for driving all vehicles that way, especially as the Conestoga size dominated the early roads, and its use spread to other colonies and states such as Maryland and Virginia. The bottom right photograph also shows a Conestoga wagon jack. Every teamster carried a heavy jack developed especially for the mighty Conestoga wagon. The jack was needed to raise the wagon so that wheels could be removed periodically for lubrication. The wagon axle was made of wood, its ends wrapped with sheet iron around which the wheel hubs turned. With the wheel off, the teamster spread grease from the tar pot over the axle end. A real wheel weighed as much as 200 pounds and had to be maneuvered carefully to avoid injury. This is a bill of lading and contract that records the promise of payment to Martin and Jacob Frey of Lancaster for conveying goods by Conestoga wagon from a Philadelphia merchant to Frederick Rapp of Economy, Pennsylvania, dated September 15, 1830. This document contains a host of information about the use of Conestoga wagons during the height of their transportation importance, including all the boxes that were delivered and their various sizes and weights. $6.54 was received in advance, and $126.25 was paid on October 6, 1830. It's interesting to note that the Landis brothers' grandfather was only 17 when he was first charged with the responsibility of driving the Landis family Conestoga wagon to Philadelphia in 1813. He transported whiskey and flour. The busiest era of the Conestoga wagon usage was 1750 to 1850. One traveling from Lancaster to Philadelphia in the early 1800s could expect to encounter as many as 200 Conestogas on the way. The Conestoga wagon as a highway hauler fell in gradual disuse with the advent of canals and railroads. But remember, the Conestoga wagon is not a prairie schooner. Thank you. We got through that.
Thank you, Jen. I know I've been, as a newcomer, I've certainly been guilty of calling it a prairie schooner. So hopefully you'll never have to correct me again. And just a point of clarification for those of you who know Zoom, we have a professional subscription, not the free. So it shouldn't go off in 40 minutes. So who knows what gremlins are in the system. So thanks, Jen. And now we go to another form of transportation, and we end with the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, looking at one particular avocation, the Pullman Porters. So the floor is yours, Dottie.
Share my screen here. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about Pullman Porters. When thinking about the topic of trades and jobs in railroading, I have a plethora of choices. And this here is a non-exhaustive list of jobs past and present that have been done on the railroads. But the railroad job I'm going to talk about today is the Pullman Porter. So one of the reasons I chose this job is that we recently received a Pullman Porter hat badge as a donation. Now, this badge is made from brass and has enameled lettering. Hat badge is attached to the front of an employee's hat and identify that railroad worker to the public. While we do not know the individual who wore this particular hat badge, it represents a well-known railroad job and a story that the museum would like to tell, but which we don't have a lot of small artifacts or images to help tell that story. So receiving this object was exciting from my point of view. This picture here is one of a very small handful of images that are in our collection that shows a real Pullman Porter on the job. It's not an advertisement or a stage photo. You can see he's wearing his formal jacket and cap, where you can see the hat badge, identical to the one we received. And these items were worn when the porter was helping passengers on and off the train. However, when the porter was working inside the car, he would wear a white jacket but not the hat when he was on duty. So the story of the Pullman Porter starts in the 1860s with George Pullman, who formed the Pullman Company to build luxury sleeping cars. The company built and staffed the cars and then would lease the cars to the railroads. These cars were an upgrade from the railroad's regular cars with improved furnishings and amenities. Now, these cars featured attentive staff to cater to the needs of travelers, and service is what set this company apart and why it became profitable. So Pullman hired Black men as porters to take care of the cars and attend to the needs of the passengers. Many of these men had been enslaved prior to the end of the Civil War. Pullman could pay lower wages to these newly freed Black men looking for jobs outside of agriculture and the South. And keeping the time period in mind, George Pullman believed Black people were suited to this type of service work and that passengers would feel more comfortable with Black attendants. Given the vast social divide during this era, it would have been easier for the passengers to act if the porters were not there. So it was safe to act as you wanted around them, and you wouldn't have to worry about seeing them in real life. Pullman porters did everything on a sleeping car. They would assist passengers with baggage, getting on and off the train. They would make up, or as they called it, make down the sleeping spaces. They would attend to restrooms, babysit children, take care of sick passengers, bring ladders to passengers sleeping in the upper berth, general cleaning and upkeep of the car, and just attend to the general needs of the passengers, shine shoes, adjust the temperature, bring food, drinks, mail letters, anything they needed. Now, being a Pullman porter provided a steady job and a paycheck. Pullman porters are often credited with the development of the Black middle class in America. The job also allowed these men to travel and share those experiences with their families and communities. However, it was very low paying. Many porters lived off tips, particularly in the early years, and preparing the car prior and after its run was unpaid. Porters had to work long, hard hours with very little time to rest during a trip, if they could get any rest at all. A porter was on call during the trip, and there was very little downtime, if any. Someone always needs something. These long hours could put a strain on family life. And porters often received poor treatment from passengers. They were often called George, taken from George Pullman, rather than their real names. And sometimes they're even called worse derogatory names. Other verbal abuse, humiliation, and physical abuse was also common. Porters also received poor treatment by the company and their supervisors. They could be fired for very minor issues, and there was no opportunity to become a conductor. Conductor positions went to white men who supervised the porters. Like other Black railroad workers, they were excluded from brotherhoods and trade unions. Pullman did have a company-based benefits program, but it did not provide the same kind of representation that a brotherhood or union could. And early efforts to create a union were stamped out, and porters associated with those efforts were fired, usually citing some other minor offense. Porters finally received effective union representation with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The Brotherhood formed in 1925 and was led by A. Philip Randolph, a labor activist and organizer who was not a Pullman employee and therefore would be resistant to company intimidation. Randolph was also an important figure in the civil rights movement and was an organizer of the 1963 March on Washington. So previous attempts at unionization were unsuccessful, and there were struggles during the first decade of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. But finally, in 1937, the Pullman Company signed a contract with the BSCP, and this agreement reduced the monthly workload of porters from 400 hours a month to 240 hours, and it also increased wages. And this was the first time a major company signed an agreement with a labor organization led by Black men. So while this is a small object, and the story of the Pullman Porter is way more complex than I can fit into just 5 minutes, this hat badge gives the museum an opportunity to at least get the conversation started on talking about Pullman Porters and their place in railroading history. Thank you.
Fantastic. Big stories come in small packages. So, John, if you're still there with us, we have a question that goes back to what you talked about. We have a participant who was talking about a grandfather who died in the Hudson coal mine by falling rock in 1926. And this gentleman was an immigrant from Poland. So you mentioned the opportunity to take a test. So the question is, were there separate tests for the immigrants printed in their native language, or did they have to or did they have to know the English language?
Yeah. So generally, yeah, the tests were taken at the county level, usually at the county courthouse. So in this case, it would have been Luzerne County and or Lackawanna County, whatever county that the miner lived in. He had to take the test there, and they were usually in English. There were signs at the particular collieries that were in multiple languages, various Eastern European languages and as well as English, but the test, the actual mining certificate test, that was in English. It was not in multiple languages.
Okay, great. And Jennifer, how frequently were Conestoga wagons traveling out west? Were there many individuals who owned Conestogas, or were they rented out through companies?
The Conestoga wagon would not have gone out west. It would have gone to Baltimore or Philadelphia to stay close to the cities from the rural areas. It was mainly owned by farmers, and sometimes a farmer would, if there was one Conestoga wagon, it would help some of the other local farmers in the area get their goods back and forth. But it would never travel empty. It would always bring the goods to Philadelphia, Baltimore, and be full on the way back to sell the items back in Lancaster or wherever it was going.
Great. And for those of you on the call interested in learning more or visiting some of our sites, one of our colleagues put a link for PA Trails of History in the chat box, where you can go and look into exploring all of these wonderful museums and more across the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So thank you to our presenters. I'm about to present our poll. Again, we have John Fielding sharing tools and training and trades for anthracite mining. Mike Emery looking at gutter tools and their connection to iron manufacture, not just at Cornwall, but all throughout Pennsylvania. Linda looking at ICS catalog, an important resource in the early 20th century Navy. We have the Conestoga wagon, and then we have a small artifact telling a big story at Pullman. So let's hope this works. And pick one of the sites as soon as you see the poll, and we'll give you a couple minutes. And there you go. Please, please vote. Oh, they're coming fast and furious. Still a few stragglers. Oh, it's looking neck and neck for two particular sites. We have 86% of the participants having voted, 88%. Okay, the remaining 6 of you, you've just got a little bit more time to vote. If I could hum a tune, I'd hum the Jeopardy music, but we'll go ahead and give it 5 more seconds. And the poll is closed. So I'm pleased to report for our kickoff of the collections program of Collection Showcase of 2022. The top vote getter was Landis Valley and the Conestoga Wagon. Coming in second was the Pullman badge, and coming in third was Anthracite. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for voting. It means that once again, Landis Valley Village and Farm Museum will be hosting one of these wonderful programs in later in 2022. A shameless plug for Landis Valley. If you'd like this program, tomorrow evening, same Zoom channel, same Zoom time, we'll be doing a virtual lecture looking at the unique Pennsylvania farmstead of Peter Wentz, preserved by Montgomery County Parks in Montgomery County, and looking at its unique connections to George Washington, the Revolutionary War, and Pennsylvania German agriculture. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for presenting these fabulous pieces and stories from your collections. Thank you all for joining us tonight on Collection Showcase. Go to Pennsylvania Trails of History to learn more, and we hope to see you here on Zoom later on in this year. Be safe, be warm, and have a good night.